Well, it's November 12th. Remembrance Day is over, so put away the poppy for another year, eh? It's easy to do that. I mean, there are other things to care about. But what I want to take a moment to do is to tell you two things first. First off, the CBC has doubled down on their attack on our Canadian forces. You'll recall that last week they tried to gin up a scandal involving a skit that some soldiers did, making fun of Osama bin Laden's older brother, Eugene. Of course, bin Laden doesn't have a brother named Eugene. It was a joke. The whole thing was a joke. It was a joke night at the mess hall, and our soldiers were doing skits. I guess some of our soldiers figured they'd been spending years figuring out how to kill Al-Qaeda and the Taliban, so maybe it's okay if they tell a few jokes about them too. Now, this skit was done in 2010, but the CBC got their hands on a video of it just a few weeks ago. But they held it back and broadcast it as a huge exclusive late last week. They deliberately saved it. It was their big Remembrance Day special, their thumb in the eye of our soldiers. Now, the problem was, from the CBC's point of view, that there's actually nothing scandalous with the skit. I mean, it pokes fun at someone named Eugene bin Laden. And that's about it. But as we showed you on Friday, the CBC went nuts, calling it offensive and racially charged. Look.
Video bombshell for Canada's military, a CBC News exclusive on why this soldier's humor is being viewed as offensive.
It's racially charged. Why was it made? What's the government saying about it? Obviously, it's racially charged.
The Canadian military has launched an investigation into a racially charged video created by members of the Canadian Forces.
I don't need to really give you any of the details of the video, except that the language is offensive.
Canada's military is investigating an offensive video.
Behavior that's not really becoming of a member of the military.
Yeah, I guess so. As in, Eugene bin Laden looked brown and speaks with an accent, and, that's it. That's all that's offensive about it. I mean, the whole thing was an attempt to smear our troops, just like they did a few years ago when they claimed that our Canadian forces engaged in war crimes in Afghanistan. The CBC ran that smear for more than a year without a shred of proof. And when an independent inquiry of 3 judges looking into the matter exhaustively found the allegation to be a lie, the CBC never apologized. Nope. This is their second round, though. But here's the thing. It was a very weak criticism. The CBC knew they hadn't really been persuasive, no matter how often they called this skit a shocking exclusive and used the words offensive and racially charged. It actually wasn't a big deal. It was so obviously a CBC smear job against our troops. So they called for some reinforcements. A real comedian to say that, yes, it was offensive and racially charged. They called on one of their own in-house comedians from the CBC show, This Hour Has 22 Minutes. Now, the CBC has a ton of comedians on staff. 4 full-time cast members of This Hour Has 22 Minutes. 7 more at the Royal Canadian Air Force. And that doesn't include their freelancers like Mary Walsh. And those are just the on-camera comedians. They have many more comedy writers, too. The CBC has dozens of comedians on staff. But they were very political in who they chose to talk about this. They chose the only visible minority working for them, Sean Majumder. Of course they did, because they were trying to make the case that the Canadian forces were racist, except that everyone else behind this smear job was white. They were so white they're pink. So they called him Majumder, and he gave them exactly what they paid him to say.
Muslims have faced so much backlash here in Canada and in the United States over a small group of people in these countries who are fundamentalists, and for us to poke fun at those people is wrong outright.
Yeah, but as we showed you on Friday, Majumder himself has mocked Osama bin Laden, so Majumder was really turning himself into a pretzel, explaining why he's allowed to mock Osama bin Laden, but our soldiers aren't. Why it's funny when he puts on a Middle Eastern accent, but it's offensive and racially charged when our soldiers do it. And his conclusion was exactly what the white liberals in Toronto wanted it to be. Our soldiers are offensive brutes. So much so that the CBC actually called in the military police to watch this spoof video at their offices. Seriously, the CBC wanted arrests. Well, over the weekend I got on Twitter and started asking Sean Majumder about his hypocrisy. Why he thinks he can mock bin Laden, but our soldiers can't. How it feels for him to be a comedian who publicly denounces other people for their jokes. How he feels about his bosses calling in the police to rat out our troops to them. Majumder didn't do too well arguing with me. He responded mainly with insults, but boy did he get an earful from plenty of Canadians furious with his complicity in the CBC smear of our soldiers. See, Majumdar was necessary to give the smear credibility. As in, here's a brown guy who says our troops are racist, so they must be racist. And Majumdar was happy to go along with that. That's the only reason they asked him. He was their token minority agreeing with them about the offensiveness of mocking bin Laden. Well, Majumdar didn't have a good time on Twitter on the weekend. He learned that Canadians love a comedian, but they hate a politically correct snitch trying to smear our soldiers. But then Majumdar did something just plain weird. He ended his online debate with me this way, by signing off saying, "White power." That's it. That's what he said. You can see it right there. That's all he said. Now, what does it mean? Does it mean he's a white supremacist? No, it's pretty safe to assume he's not. I mean, he's brown. Okay, does he think our soldiers were white supremacists then? Maybe. I mean, he said their jokes were insensitive and inappropriate, and his bosses called them offensive and racially charged. So maybe he was calling our troops white power activists, but I doubt it. He had been backpedaling online for hours trying to say he supported our troops, really. So, and here I'm just guessing, I think he was trying to make some sort of a joke, some sort of satire. I mean, not very funny. Majumdar doesn't do too well without a laugh track and without plenty of writers paid for by our tax dollars. Out there on Twitter, it's just him and his own sense of humor. In a conversation about whether or not our troops were racist, he thought he'd end by writing simply, "White power." Yeah, not really smart and not really funny. Now, I don't think he's a white supremacist, and I don't even think he's calling our troops that. I think he was just tired and embarrassed, and he was slowly realizing what a stupid thing he had done, and he was probably a bit mad that the CBC brass used him as racial cover for their smear. That's my theory. But here's my point. Imagine if someone else had written simply, "White power." Imagine if a white reporter or comedian at the CBC did that. Remember the comedian who played the character Kramer on the TV show Seinfeld? He was in a comedy club 6 years ago, and he made racially charged comments too, and it practically ended his career. Do you really think a white CBC comedian would survive such an outburst saying white power? Well, how about a Canadian soldier? See, that's my point. That's what we're talking about here. The CBC engaged in an elaborate witch hunt and even called in the military police because some soldiers were blowing off steam making fun of Eugene bin Laden. Now, they didn't use any racial slurs or derogatory phrases, but it was still too much for the CBC and Majumdar. But then Majumdar himself goes and publishes a tweet saying, "White power?" Do you think a soldier would last 24 hours if he did that? Do you think the CBC would leave the Canadian forces alone until such a soldier was arrested and drummed out of the force? The CBC are a disgrace. They despise our troops 364 days a year. And then for 24 hours, once a year, on Remembrance Day, they pretend to love our troops. That's why I'm still talking about this on November 12th. Because the smear against our Canadian forces continues. And one of the smearers himself, Sean Majumdar, who says our soldiers can't mock Osama bin Laden, goes ahead and shouts white power on the internet. This man and the CBC thinks he's morally superior to our troops. What a disgrace they are. I invited Majumdar to come on this show. I told him I was going to criticize him today, but I'd let him rebut me, and I'd give him the last word too. Well, he declined. Here's what he wrote to me on Twitter. He said, "Go after CBC all you want. I'm independent of them and do shows for the military. Please be careful painting me personally as anti-soldier. That's all I ask." All right, Sean, I won't paint you as anti-soldier. I'll let your own words and deeds speak for themselves. I'm going to end my show today with a poem. Yeah, I said it, a poem. It was written more than 100 years ago by one of the great poets of the age, Rudyard Kipling, a conservative poet and author. He's the same one who wrote The Jungle Book and Gunga Din and the great poem If. This one's called Tommy Atkins, which is what the ordinary British soldier was called. Tommy Atkins, sort of like what we call G.I. Joe. I'll read the poem and you'll see why. Here it is. I went into a public house to get a pint of beer. The publican, he up and says, "We serve no redcoats here." The girls behind the bar, they laughed and giggled fit to die. I outs into the street again, and to myself says I, "Oh, it's Tommy this and Tommy that and Tommy go away. But it's thank you, Mr. Atkins, when the band begins to play." The band begins to play, my boys. The band begins to play. Oh, it's thank you, Mr. Atkins, when the band begins to play. I went into a theater as sober as could be. They gave a drunk civilian room, but hadn't none for me. They sent me to the gallery around the music halls, but when it comes to fighting, Lord, they'll shove me in the stalls, for it's Tommy this and Tommy that, and Tommy wait outside. Oh, but it's special train for Atkins when the troop ship's on the tide. Yes, making mock uniforms that guard you while you sleep is cheaper than them uniforms, and their starvation cheap. And hustling drunken soldiers when they're going large a bit is 5 times better business than parading in full kit. Then it's Tommy this and Tommy that and Tommy, how's your soul? But it's thin red line of heroes when the drums begin to roll. We aren't no thin red heroes, nor we aren't no blackguards too, but single men in barracks most remarkable like you. And if sometimes our conduct isn't all your fancy paints, well, single men in barracks don't grow up into plaster saints. While it's Tommy this and Tommy that and Tommy fall behind, but it's pleased to walk in front, sir, when there's trouble in the wind. You talk of better food for us and schools and fires and all. We'll wait for extra rations if you treat us rational. Don't mess around the cookroom stops, but prove it to our face. The widow's uniform is not the soldier man's disgrace, for it's Tommy this and Tommy that and chuck him out, the brute. But it's savior of his country when the guns begin to shoot, and it's Tommy this and Tommy that and anything you please. But Tommy ain't a bloomin' fool. You bet that Tommy sees.